a horror franchise like Resident Evil, it's no surprise that the lore gets pretty disturbing and horrifying the deeper you dive into it. However, what's a little more shocking when it comes to the lore of the series is that, well, most of the disturbing pieces of information in the series come in the form of hidden files scattered throughout the franchise. Sure, seeing a zombie bust through a closet door and trying to eat you is pretty disturbing in its own right, but let's face it, it's the backstory of said zombie that you learn about when reading his journal on a desk in front of the closet that quite honestly really sends a shiver down your spine, now doesn't it? So on this episode of Nerd Space Games, we're taking a look at the most chilling and most disturbing files scattered throughout the Resident Evil franchise. Obviously, trigger warning by the way before you dive into this video, because these files get really, and I mean really disturbing at times, trust me on that. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Finally, we do eventually have a Nerd Space game shop, so consider picking up some threads inspired by your favorite Resident Evil character today. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerd Space Games, and here are the 10 most disturbing hidden files of Resident Evil. Let's get it. Number 10, Prisoner's Diary, Resident Evil, Code Veronica. One of the villains in Code Veronica, Alfred Ashford, is clearly a disturbed individual, morally speaking that is. Whether it's because of the fact that his sister, Alexia, left on him in her pursuit of power, or it was the fact that he lost her for 15 years of his life, Alfred kinda went crazy and used Rockford Island and the prisoners there as test subjects for his ruthless experiments. Throughout the game though, we don't really get to experience how horrible this place was for prisoners unless we dive into some files. One such file, the Prisoner's Diary, which is located on a bed in the bunkhouse, perfectly describes exactly what life on Rockford Island was like here. The prisoner writing this diary came here unaware of what exactly this place was until he heard from one of his fellow inmates of why he was put here, because he made a small mistake that ultimately pissed Alfred off. Yeah, so moral of the story by the way, don't piss Alfred off. Moving on, the file goes on to describe some of the horrific experiments that go on in this place, with the diary expressing how terrified the prisoner is when he follows the guards one night to see what is happening to the people trapped here, and what he sees is so disturbing he's unable to put it into writing. Reading through this file expresses how awful Alfred was to the people that wronged him and how much happiness he got out of watching his test subjects be tortured to death essentially. Number 9, Trevor's Diary, Resident Evil Remake. The story of the Trevor family is a tragic one, and it's one that we may or may not revisit again later in this video. This is the story of an architect that allowed his ego to lead him and his family to their death. George Trevor, famous architect, was hired by Oswald E. Spencer to build the Spencer Mansion complete with all of the hidden rooms, traps, and secrets inside of it. Secrets that only 2 people in the world would know about: Oswald E. Spencer, because he hired him, and the man that built the mansion, George Trevor. For this reason, Trevor had to be disposed of. Spencer lured George Trevor to this mansion and ordered his men to dispose of him. Instead, Spencer's men allowed George Trevor to escape into the tunnels, believing that he could get away. In George Trevor's diary, a file that is split into 3 different parts, with the final and most tragic part located next to a grave on the ground, we learn more about Trevor's fate. In this journal, he writes about his regrets, about how he's worried about his wife, Jessica, and his daughter, Lisa, how he prays that they are okay, but us the viewers are already aware of their fate. He even talks about how he realizes that they are probably dead because of things said by the guards responsible for bringing him here, but he keeps holding out hope for his family in the hope that they are potentially still alive. In Trevor's final moments, he keeps trying to have hope in this belief while he writes in his diary about how he'll die here, starved to death essentially, in front of a grave with his name on it. It's a sad story, especially when you realize that the one thing that he has hope for is already lost, as by this point, we're already well aware of his family's fate, unfortunately. Number 8, in Imprisoned Boy Diary, Resident Evil Survivor. So yeah, there's a recurring theme of prisoners and captives of Umbrella writing diary and journal entries just before they end up as test subjects for some truly disturbing experiments. A lot of the files that we find in different Resident Evil games usually dive deep into the tragic and horrifying things Umbrella does to their test subjects and prisoners. Even in a spin-off game, Resident Evil Survivor, we learn all about how far Umbrella is willing to go to create the perfect BOWs to sell on the black market. In this case, we learned that the next generation of tyrants, aka the Mr. X's of the world, are created from the substance extracted directly from the brain of teenagers. In a diary found inside of a prison cell, we learn about a teenage boy from Congo that was abducted by Umbrella and used for such a purpose. In his diary, we learn how Umbrella abducts teenagers from all around the world and sends them to Sheena Island to be used as test subjects and to remove this substance from their brain to create more tyrants. The Imprisoned Boy's diary gets even more disturbing when he points out that it's not just the guards that are evil, but the entire island, as almost everybody on this island knows exactly what's going on but chooses not to do anything about it. They all just step aside and allow Vincent and Umbrella to continue to kill teenagers one by one to extract this substance, all in the pursuit of more money. The journal ends on a cliffhanger as apparently the teenagers attempt to break out and escape the island, but we can sadly assume this ends in failure as nothing else was reported about this breakout throughout the game, which means they probably failed. Number 7, Lucas's journal, Resident Evil 7. Okay, so this next one is a little more straightforward than the rest of the entries on today's video, as it shows us just how disturbed Lucas Baker was even as a boy. Instead of a victim writing in their journal about the things that they are witnessing, Lucas as a kid writes about what he does to his school bully. Now obviously I totally respect anybody that stands up to bullies, but clearly Lucas goes way too far in dealing with his bully. In his journal, Lucas writes about a classmate of his, Oliver, who teases him by calling him names like Crazy Head. Well, instead of telling his parents or teacher, Lucas decides to handle it himself by inviting Oliver over to his house, saying he's hosting a birthday party and he wants Oliver to come over. Well, when Oliver shows up, Lucas traps Oliver in the attic, which just so happens to be located in Lucas's room. He then changes out the remote control to the attic and hides it. A torn page from that same journal confirms what we all fear. Oliver remained trapped in that attic, constantly being on the floor and walls, screaming for Lucas to let him out before he went silent, dying of either starvation or dehydration. The body even decomposes, eventually to the point where there's an awful smell, confirming that Lucas lived with a rotting body directly above him for God knows how long. Yeah, Lucas was a bad seed for a long time and was even willing to kill long before Evelyn came along. Evelyn just gave him the means to do it on a much higher level. Side note, the circumstances around Oliver's death are kinda weird when you think about it. Wouldn't his parents know that he was coming over to Lucas's house? The Baker family never once went into the attic after Oliver died. And how long did Lucas let his corpse up there rot in the attic before he did something with the body? I guess we'll never know, but one thing is for certain, Lucas was always a fucked up person, even as a kid. Number 6, Communication Officer Journal, Resident Evil Revelations. Ever since I played Resident Evil Revelations, the word Mayday has been transformed in my brain. I mean, now every time I hear this word, I immediately think of the disturbing voice of the communications officer repeating the word over and over again in a tone that just immediately gives me chills. Yeah, it's arguably one of the more horrifying moments in the Resident Evil series, despite it appearing in a mostly non-scary entry of the franchise. And if the voice and monster design of this creature isn't enough to do it for you, try reading his final journal entry found in the same room where this monster is locked up. This journal, like the Keeper's Diary in the first game, recounts the final moments of this individual as he slowly changes into the disturbing monster that we all come across in the storeroom of the cafeteria. In said journal, the communication officer locks himself away from the infected creatures roaming around, only to then get attacked by one that slipped through the air vents and infect him. After becoming infected, we see in his journal entries that he slowly begins to change both in mind and in health. He gets a cold, a lump in his throat, and then eventually after a few days his body begins to morph and create an additional head on his body that is obsessed with meat. He begins having conversations with this additional head on his body to the point where he begins to fight with it. Eventually, we see in the journal that his mind begins to disappear completely, giving full control to this new form that has grown out of him courtesy of this infection. Yeah, it's all very disturbing to read, especially when you combine the final moments of him writing Mayday in his journal to then hearing him say it before he attacks you in the cafeteria. Number 5, Taxidermy Log, Resident Evil 2 Remake. So whether you're looking at the original game or the remake of Resident Evil 2, Chief Brian Irons is one fucked up individual. And yeah, while this is clearly shown on screen, man oh man, it's in the files where things really depict how disgusting this man really is. Again, you can really go with the original or the remake in this regard, as the original has his diary which goes into detail about what he does to other humans and how he's hunting the mayor's daughter as a trophy. But for me, it's the Taxidermy Log in the remake that takes the cake as most disturbing in my opinion. At first glance, if you read very fast and you don't look into the details too hard, it doesn't look like much. Just a crazy man obsessed with his taxidermy hobby. However, it's when you really read each word of this disturbing file that you begin to realize how truly disgusting Chief Irons is. First off, at one point in the log, he talks about how gutting a tiger literally made him come. Yeah, I can't make this shit up. He came after gutting a fucking tiger. Jesus, dude. To make matters worse, the later part of the law compares Catherine, the mayor's daughter, to a pig as he begins his work on her next. Honestly, Brian Irons might be one of the most disturbed human beings, if I can call him that, because he's pretty much a monster in all horror games, period. Like, you have to be one fucked up person to get off on a dead animal and then compare a human body to a pig as you are dissecting them. Christ, dude. Number 4, The Keeper's Diary, Resident Evil. Well, I mentioned how the comms officer in Revelations took inspiration from The Keeper's Diary in the way that it followed the writer's descent into a monster, but it's as they always say, there's nothing like the original. Appearing in both the original game and the remake, albeit with some minor changes to both variations of this file, The Keeper's Diary remains to this day one of the most iconic files in the entire Resident Evil series. In fact, we've seen multiple fans recreate stories and fanfiction films of the story, including Resident Evil's very own The Keeper's Diary. But yeah, there's good reason for that. It's a horrifying story to read, even if it's honestly quite simple on paper. The story tells of a man who is infected with the T-virus after an accident, and it ultimately leads to him slowly changing. And I don't mean like you get sick, you die, and you wake up as a zombie. No, The Keeper's Diary dives deeper into these transformations by showing us that at least during part of the final transformation, the victim still has some form of intelligence and personality left in them. For example, the Keeper begins to get the urge to feed on meat and gets extremely angry at pet peeves that ultimately lead to him killing and eating his own friend. And this happens while he is still able to write in a journal, by the way. Chilling, right? And of course, we can't talk about The Keeper's Diary without referencing the most chilling phrase you'll ever read in a file in the Resident Evil series: itchy tasty. God, I love good horror short stories in my horror games. Just saying. Number 3, Village Youth Diary, Resident Evil 5. The one question that might come to mind when playing through games like RE4 and RE5 is, where are all the children at? Yeah, unless you read the hidden files scattered throughout the game, or even read the end credits scene that hints towards the fate of them in RE4, the kids in these villages that Leon and Chris find themselves in all just seem to disappear off the face of the earth. Of course, the innocent side of you will say, oh, maybe they just didn't have kids, or maybe the children ran away in time. Yeah, this is Resident Evil we're talking about. If you were to search around the marshlands in Resident Evil 5, hidden inside of one of the settlements, you can find the Village Youth Diary. This diary talks about how a man from the oil fields came to the village to help them in various ways. The company from the oil fields built forms of transportation for the villagers and even provided them with alcohol and other forms of medicine. However, after time, the people from the oil field talked about a new disease that was spreading around, and in order to protect the villagers, they all needed to get shots that the man said was medicine to protect them from this disease. This is where things got bad, of course. After receiving these shots, all the children of the village grew sick and eventually died, leading to the villagers becoming extremely angry and violent. They once again confronted the man about the medicine they took, thinking that this medicine was responsible for the death of all the kids, which, by the way, it was. Shocker. But the man from the oil rig said that it was because of the disease he warned the villagers about and manipulated them to once again take more shots. Eventually, the village became hostile, changing into monsters and losing all forms of their personality, replaced with one urge, the urge to kill. We even saw the writer of this diary change over time, eventually being taken over by this same urge. Obviously, this was confirmation that not only did Tricell come into the village and affect the villagers, but the infection killed all the children in the village and changed the adults into monsters. So yeah, that's why there's no children in Resident Evil 5. Who knew? Number 2, A Family Picture and Notes, Resident Evil Remake. As teased earlier, the tragic story of the Trevor family doesn't end with Trevor's journal, but rather a file and picture we find that tells us the fate of his wife Jessica and his daughter Lisa Trevor. Before I talk about this file, it's worth mentioning that in other files it was revealed that Lisa, Jessica, Trevor were kidnapped and used as test subjects by Umbrella. In the first part of this file, we see the strain of viruses both of them were infected with. We also see that the virus eventually took Jessica's life. In terms of Lisa, she fused with the virus, and from that point on, as a 14-year-old girl, by the way, she became a human cocktail of viruses for Umbrella to test on for about 3 decades. Before reading her journal though, at the end of the file, we have a letter from Jessica addressed to her daughter. In this letter, she talks about wanting to escape with Lisa and help Lisa get away before the virus. They keep giving her wipes away all of her memories. She even plans on escaping soon, but we can assume that she dies from the virus before she's able to carry out her escape plan, leaving Lisa alone. Sadly, the file gets much worse. Throughout Lisa's time there, she's used in experiments that only make her worse, causing her to lose herself, her personality, and even most of her speech. The one thing that she holds on to though is the hope that she'll eventually be reunited with her mother. Umbrella, the pieces of shit that they are, uses this to their advantage by having one of the researchers that kind of looks like the deceased Jessica Trevor pretend to be Lisa's mother to convince her to do what they want her to do and keep her calm. Unfortunately for the scientists, that didn't go well over for her at all once Lisa found out the truth and believed that this woman stole her mother's face. Yeah, she pretty much carved her face off and kept it for herself, later attaching it to her own face so that she can keep her face warm until she reunited with her mother to give it back to her. The rest of the file slowly depicts Lisa's final stages of losing herself, only repeating the phrase mother and mom and miss you before the journal ends, which pretty much catches us up to how we see Lisa Trevor in Resident Evil Remake as Chris and Jill comes across her in the Spencer mansion. Number 1, The Orphanage Files Resident Evil 2 Remake. So technically speaking, I'm combining a total of 4 different files into a single entry on today's list, as I'm looking at all the files, aka journals and letters, found in the Raccoon City Orphanage and RE2 Remake as one entry. I mean, I know that's kind of cheating, but all of these 4 files combined are what really paint the entire picture for us. But if you want to be nitpicky, then I'd say maybe Tom or Blank's diaries are probably the most disturbing of the bunch. But yeah, this is arguably the only files that literally made me tear up reading, so trigger warning before I dive into this because it's extremely fucked up. Like, trust me, there's a reason why it's at number 1. Starting with Sally's diary, you can just ignore, as there's not much there outside of showcasing the innocence of these poor children. Tom's diary is probably the one that really starts to showcase exactly what's going on with this orphanage. It starts off with him being happy about his friend Oliver being adopted and how Oliver stopped talking to him after he left. Then after hearing a horror story from another orphan about how there's a boogeyman living under the orphanage and how nobody actually gets adopted but rather they are turned into food for the boogeyman, Tom begins to notice weird things, like how they get shots every day and how they are not allowed to have contact with the outside world. Then Tom finds out he's getting adopted, forgets everything that worried him in the first place, as he's so excited and shocked because at his age he didn't expect to be adopted. That is until his best friend Oliver returns, all mutated, to warn Tom of what's really happening to the orphans. This file is followed up with a letter from Chief Irons that tells us what happens after this incident. After Oliver broke out, Umbrella and Irons were worried about him affecting the rest of the children, so they dispose of Oliver and all of the children immediately. Yeah, told you it was tragic. One last file I want to mention is Blank's diary, an unnamed file that describes a child's viewpoint of a zombie eating everybody in the orphanage in front of him, begging for his mom to save him. I have no words, none at all. These files might very well be Resident Evil and Capcom's most disturbing moment in this series, and they are all only experienced if you pick up and read some of the hidden files scattered throughout the orphanage. Kinda crazy to think about. But yeah, that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is the Orphanage Files, or whatever one you want to pick out of those 4 files, the most disturbing file in the entire Resident Evil series, or are there any other horrifying files that completely missed my list that you think should have made this list? Let me know all of your thoughts down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content, especially if you like Resident Evil. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.